This is apropos. Well, Russia has been attacking the Ukrainian capital Kyiv with a sophisticated combination of missiles and drones for the first time in more than 2 months. 8 regions were targeted in the assault, which came as the US Secretary of State said Washington intended to bolster military support to Ukraine during the final months of the Biden presidency. Antony Blinken was speaking in Brussels amid mounting political uncertainty in Kyiv over how a US administration under Donald Trump will change American policy on the war. Cami Knight has the latest.
Residents of Kyiv woke up to the sound of air raid sirens. An air defence fire. It was the first missile attack on the capital since August, but seeking shelter has become almost routine, entire families taking refuge in metro stations.
It's horrible every time there's a missile attack. We've got used to drone strikes, if it's even possible to get used to them, because they fly over us every night. The Kyiv region suffers constantly.
On the outskirts of Kyiv, falling debris injured several people after a warehouse caught fire. The fresh round of attacks involved 6 cruise and ballistic missiles and 90 drones, only about half of which were intercepted by air defence systems across the country. Ukraine has also lost ground on the front line in recent weeks, and many feared that the election of Donald Trump could mean a reduction in US support that could have a decisive impact on the war with Russia. Trump has often praised Vladimir Putin and suggested in September that Ukraine should have, quote, given a little bit to Moscow to secure a truce. On a visit to Brussels for talks with the head of NATO, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken sought to reassure Ukrainians.
President Biden fully intends to drive through the tape and use every day to continue to do what we've done over these last 4 years, which is strengthen this alliance, to continue to shore up everything we're doing for Ukraine, to make sure that it can effectively defend itself against this Russian aggression.
As Ukraine's biggest provider of military aid by far, US support is essential, particularly after Tuesday's confirmation that as many as 10,000 North Korean soldiers were already fighting in Kursk alongside Russian forces.
To discuss, we're joined now by Olga Oliker, Programme Director for Europe and Central Asia at the International Crisis Group. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening, Olga. As we saw there in Cami's report, there have been further strikes on Kyiv over the past 24 hours. Russian forces continuing to make gains on the eastern front lines. How concerned are Ukrainians about what happens over the coming months?
Look, Ukrainians have been in a full-scale war for nearly 3 years. They've been at war for a decade. So, of course, they're concerned. Of course, they worry about what comes next. But I think there's also a certain stoicism in that country and a certain recognition. You know, on the one hand, people are exhausted by the war. On the other hand, I have yet to speak to any Ukrainians who are looking to surrender. And who see that as a way out, because fundamentally they see that as the end of their country.
And your organisation had said last month there was a growing understanding, as you've suggested there, that a ceasefire is perhaps more realistic at this stage than a battleground victory for Ukraine. What concessions do you think Kyiv may be forced to make with Donald Trump in the White House in the new year?
So, look, I think some of the discussion of ceasefires and deals misses the very critical point that even if the Ukrainians would very much like a break, the Russians have been trying to send a signal that they don't want or need a break. So I think the question you want to ask is, if that's what you're looking for, is what would bring the Russians to the negotiating table? And I think one of the problems is you often hear this formulation of land for peace, which ignores the actual reason Russia is fighting this war. And it's not for Ukrainian territory. It's basically a war over Ukrainian sovereignty. So any deal that gives Russia what it wants, that's not a question of giving it land for peace. It's a question, if what you're trying to do is give the Russians what they want, it's giving away Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, that has repercussions for European security, which would be very negative. So even aside from what happens in Ukraine. So this is the real challenge, right? How do you get to a sustainable peace, one that actually Ukraine walks away from with sovereignty, wherever, whatever territory it does or does not control?
And it would also be trying to ensure that it has security guarantees to deter further Russian attacks. Do you think that is likely to be something that Moscow would agree to?
So, look, it depends on how you define security guarantees. When the Russians were negotiating with the Ukrainians in spring of 2022, they also talked about security guarantees, including from Russia. But what you're talking about is promises from other countries that they will come to Ukraine's assistance. To some extent, Ukraine has that. It has signed agreements with, I think, 20 countries. But what does that mean? Will those countries fight for them? Will they risk a war with Russia? Is a security guarantee from Russia, a promise from Russia that it won't do anything worth the paper it's printed on? So, it's not as simple as saying there will be security guarantees. I think one thing that has fallen by the wayside with the election of Donald Trump is any expectation of Ukraine getting. It already has an invitation in the broad sense, but of Ukraine having a path to NATO membership anytime soon. But even without Donald Trump, I think it was long difficult to imagine a U.S. Senate that was going to ratify Ukraine in NATO.
So will Europe have to do more to ensure its own security? We've already seen suggestions that European leaders are thinking that way.
Look, Europe will probably have to do more for Ukraine than for themselves if they want any hope of a stable peace and a secure Europe. I think that was going to be the case whether or not Donald Trump was elected, but it is the case faster and more urgently with Donald Trump poised to enter the White House in January of next year.
And what exactly do you expect under his administration? You had participated yourself on a panel on his pledge to end the war in Ukraine. How quickly do you think he's going to move, or what exactly is he likely to do?
It's really hard to know because, again, it's hard to see. You could see the war ending with Ukrainian surrender, but of course that has really awful repercussions, not just for Ukraine, but as I said, for European security more broadly. And that should not be something the United States is looking to. That would be very, very bad for the United States in the long term, which has very close economic and security ties with Europe. So that's a bad plan. Russia surrendering seems very unlikely since Russia at the present moment seems to have the upper hand. So unless there's something Donald Trump knows that the rest of us don't, that doesn't seem very plausible. If he can convince the Russians and the Ukrainians that negotiations are more advantageous than continuing to fight, then there might be a way to actually move forward. But I do not know that, I don't know how he would do this. It might be possible to get Putin and Zelensky into a room, sure, but getting them to leave that room with any kind of agreement it's a different challenge.
And ahead of that, the US Secretary of State was speaking today in Brussels. He said that Washington, it intends to bolster its military support to Ukraine during the final months of the Biden presidency. It also wants to strengthen the NATO alliance. But realistically, what can be done in such a short period of time?
Look, what they're going to try to do is send as many of the weapons that have already been promised to Ukraine and already paid for or already committed to by the U.S. Congress to Ukraine. That's hard because the U.S. basically, it has to, if it doesn't have the weapons, it can't send them, right? So it needs to make sure that it's going to send what it's got, and it's going to try to provide it. But what it can't do is guarantee that the next administration and the Congress are going to continue substantial levels of assistance to Ukraine. The Europeans are looking for ways to boost their own spending, but that's hard. And they also don't have vast quantities of weapons on the shelves, right? I mean, so it's a really huge gap that the U.S. would leave if it really does cut off assistance, or even shrink it, for that matter.
And just finally, Blinken, he also referred to Russian and North Korean maneuvers in relation to what's happening in Ukraine, describing it as a two-way street, that relationship. So what might Moscow do to strengthen, do you believe, North Korea's military capacity if it were to come to that?
Look, I think the logic for North Korea of sending troops to Russia is probably that they get some battlefield experience. There might be additional side deals for some sorts of weapons production or something of that sort. But really, it's been the North Koreans sending weapons to Russia recently. I think, it's kind of watch this space for the Russian-North Korean cooperation. It's clearly become a very tight partnership. But what each of these countries gets out of it, I think we're all still not entirely clear on.
Olga, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you so much for your time with us this evening. That's Olga Oliker, Programme Director for Europe and Central Asia at the International Crisis Group. That is it from us for now. Up next, it's Eye on Africa.